"Sir, I appreciate your interest, but this is a precision instrument. It's not something you just pick up and—" The young armourer stopped mid-sentence, because the old man had already cycled the bolt. Once. Just once. And then he said 6 words that made the armourer's face go white. 6 words that identified the exact part, the exact failure, and the exact measurement, down to the 1,000th of an inch. The armourer had been working on that rifle for over an hour. The old man figured it out in 3 seconds. If that doesn't earn your respect, nothing will. Type precision in the comments if you believe experience should never be underestimated. Now, let me tell you how this happened. His name was Earl Jessup, and he was 78 years old. He lived alone in a single-story house on the eastern edge of Hayden, Colorado, a town so small that most maps only showed it as a dot between 2 highways. The house had a covered porch with a wooden rocking chair that hadn't been sat in for 2 years, because Earl couldn't get up from it without help, and asking for help wasn't something Earl Jessup did. He drove a 2004 Chevrolet Silverado with 263,000 miles on it. The tailgate was dented from a deer strike in 2011. The cab smelled like leather cleaner and black coffee. On the dashboard sat a laminated prayer card from his wife's funeral. Margaret, gone 4 years now, and beneath the passenger seat, wrapped in a chamois cloth, was a set of armourer's gauges he hadn't used professionally in over 30 years. Earl walked with a cane, not one of the sleek medical ones from a pharmacy, but a hand-carved piece of hickory that his father had shaped for him after his second knee surgery. He gripped it with his left hand, and if you watched carefully, you'd notice that his right hand never fully relaxed. The fingers stayed slightly curled, the thumb pressed against the index finger as though holding something that wasn't there. It was the hand of a man who had spent 40 years gripping tools that measured things most people couldn't see. He wore the same thing almost every day: khaki work pants, a flannel shirt buttoned to the second from the top, and a canvas jacket with a faded patch on the left breast that read US Army above a smaller line, Ordnance Corps. Most people never read the patch. Most people never looked past the cane. But what none of them knew, not the cashiers at the grocery store, not the neighbours who waved from their driveways, not even the woman at the VA clinic who called him Sweetie, was that Earl Jessup had once been the most respected small arms armourer in the entire 18th Airborne Corps. And the skills that had made him legendary hadn't faded with age. They were sitting right there in his hands, waiting. That Saturday morning, Earl drove 22 miles to the Root County Public Shooting Range. It was the kind of place that looked exactly like you'd expect. A gravel parking lot, a row of covered shooting benches, a series of berms stretching out to 300, 500 and 800 yards. The wind came straight off the Elk River Valley, and by 10 in the morning it was already gusting at 12 miles per hour from the northwest. There were maybe 15 people at the range that day. A couple of young guys in tactical vests shooting AR platform rifles at the 100-yard line, a father and daughter sighting in a hunting rifle at the 200 bench, and near the far end of the covered area, at bench number 9, a small crowd had gathered around a problem. Earl hadn't come for anything special. He came to the range every other Saturday when the weather allowed, mostly to shoot his old Remington 700, a rifle he'd owned since 1986. He'd load 5 rounds, fire them at the 300-yard target, check his group and drive home. But as he walked from the parking lot toward the benches, carrying his rifle case in one hand and leaning on his cane with the other, he could hear the conversation at bench 9. Voices overlapping, frustration in the tone. Someone said something about a feeding issue. Someone else said it might be the magazine. And beneath all of it, Earl heard the unmistakable sound of a bolt being cycled. Rough, grinding, wrong. He slowed his walk without meaning to. His right hand tightened, and the fingers that had been curled around nothing for 30 years suddenly had a reason to pay attention. But Earl didn't stop. Not yet. He kept walking toward his bench. Because Earl Jessup had learned a long time ago that nobody asks an old man with a cane for help with a rifle, not unless they've run out of every other option. The armourer's name was Kyle Beckett, and he was 26 years old. He had an associate's degree in gunsmithing from a technical college in Grand Junction, and had been the range's on-site armourer for just over a year. Kyle was good at his job, or at least he believed he was. He could break down most modern sporting rifles in under 3 minutes. He could diagnose common failures, light primer strikes, extraction issues, gas system problems, with reasonable confidence. He had a magnetic parts tray, a roll of blue shop towels, and a toolkit that he kept organised with the kind of pride that only comes from being new enough at something to still care about appearances. The rifle on his bench was a pre-1964 Winchester Model 70 in .30-06 Springfield. It belonged to a man named Dennis Hadley, who was 53, heavy-set, and visibly anxious about letting anyone touch the rifle. Dennis had inherited it from his father, who had carried a version of it in Korea. The rifle wouldn't feed. When Dennis cycled the bolt, the cartridge would hang on the feed ramp, catch at the shoulder, and refuse to chamber fully. It happened every second or third round, unpredictably. Kyle had been working on it for over an hour. He had removed the bolt, inspected the extractor, checked the ejector spring, measured the headspace with a set of go and no-go gauges. He had examined the feed lips on the magazine box, run a bore light through the chamber, and even checked the cartridges themselves for dimensional inconsistencies. Everything looked fine, everything measured within spec. And the rifle still wouldn't feed. The crowd had grown. 2 of the tactical vest shooters had drifted over. The father from Bench 5 was watching from a respectful distance. A retired sheriff's deputy named Tom Garza was leaning against the partition wall with his arms crossed, offering unsolicited theories about the follower spring. Kyle's jaw was tight. His ears were red. He was aware of every set of eyes on him, and the awareness was making his hands less steady than they should have been. He pulled the bolt back one more time, dropped a dummy round into the magazine and cycled it forward. The round caught. Again. He exhaled through his nose, set the rifle down, and put both hands flat on the bench. That was when someone behind him said, "You checked the feed ramp angle yet?" Kyle turned. The voice belonged to an old man standing about 6 feet back, leaning on a wooden cane, canvas jacket, faded army patch, a face that looked like it had been carved out of sandstone and left in the sun for about 50 years. Kyle blinked. "I appreciate the input," he said, keeping his voice professional but with an edge that the whole group could hear. "But I've been through the full checklist, twice. I'm pretty sure the feed ramp is fine." The old man nodded slowly. He didn't argue, he didn't push. He just stood there, watching, with eyes that didn't blink often enough. Earl stayed quiet. He moved to his bench, number 12, 3 spots down, and set his rifle case on the table. He unzipped it slowly the way he always did. Removed his Remington, placed it on the rest, set out his 5 loaded rounds in a line, brass gleaming in the morning sun. But he didn't shoot. He couldn't. Because the sound from bench 9 kept pulling at him. That rough grinding cycle of the bolt, that catch, that subtle metallic stutter that told him everything he needed to know about what was wrong with that Winchester, and everything he needed to know about why the young armourer couldn't hear it. It wasn't Kyle's fault. Not really. Kyle had been trained on measurements, on specs, on visual inspection and gauge readings. He'd been taught to look at things. Earl had been trained to listen. 40 years in Army Ordnance had taught Earl that a weapon talks to you if you know how to shut up and pay attention. The way a bolt slides tells you about the lug engagement. The sound of the action cycling tells you about surface contact, about tolerances, about where metal is meeting metal in ways it shouldn't. A thousandth of an inch doesn't show up on a casual visual inspection, but it sings. It makes a frequency. And if you've spent 4 decades listening to that frequency across 10,000 different weapons, you don't need gauges, you need silence. Earl loaded a round into his Remington, settled behind the scope, let his breathing slow, and fired one shot at 300 yards. The crack echoed off the berms and rolled out across the valley. He didn't check the target. He already knew where it hit. Instead, he found himself staring sideways toward bench 9, where Kyle had just removed the bolt again and was holding it up to the light like a man trying to read a language he hadn't learned yet. Earl's jaw tightened. His fingers curled again. And somewhere deep in his chest, in the place where 4 decades of muscle memory lived alongside things he never talked about, something stirred. He hadn't felt it in years. The pull, the need to put his hands on a weapon and make it right. But he stayed where he was. Because the last time he'd offered help to a young man who didn't want it, the conversation hadn't gone well. That had been 11 years ago. At a National Guard armory in Cheyenne, and the sergeant who'd dismissed him had been polite about it, but firm. "We've got it handled, sir." 4 hours later, they called him back. The weapon had a cracked firing pin retainer that nobody caught until a round failed to fire during a qualification shoot. Earl had known it the moment he'd heard the striker fall. He always knew, and that was the part that made it hurt. Not that they didn't ask for help, but that they didn't know they needed it. Another 30 minutes passed. Kyle had now disassembled the bolt entirely. Components were laid out on a blue shop towel in the order he'd been taught. Bolt body, extractor collar, firing pin assembly, bolt sleeve. He was using a set of calipers to measure the extractor hook, and checking it against the manufacturer's spec sheet he'd pulled up on his phone. Dennis Hadley was pacing behind the bench, his anxiety now edging toward irritation. "Look," Dennis said, "my dad carried that rifle through some of the worst fighting in Korea. It's been in the family for 70 years. If you can't figure out what's wrong with it, just tell me and I'll take it to a shop in Denver." Kyle's face flushed. "I can figure it out," he said, without looking up. "I just need a few more minutes." Tom Garza, the retired deputy, shifted his weight against the wall. "Could be the magazine follower," he said again. "I had a Mauser once that did the same thing. Follower was tilting." Kyle didn't respond. He reassembled the bolt with hands that were moving a little too fast now, snapped it back into the receiver, and cycled another dummy round. It caught. Same place, same angle, same failure. Kyle stared at the open action for a long moment. Then he pulled the bolt back, set the rifle on the rest, and turned around to face the group. His eyes swept across the bystanders, looking for something, an answer, a suggestion, a way out, and they landed on Earl. The old man was sitting on the bench at Station 12, his Remington cased and zipped, his 5 brass casings lined up on the table like little gold soldiers. He was watching, not staring, not smirking, just watching. With those unblinking eyes and that right hand curled around nothing. Kyle hesitated. Then he said, louder than he needed to, addressing no one in particular, "Anyone here have experience with pre-64 Model 70 actions?" It was the kind of question a man asks when he's not ready to admit he needs help, but knows he can't keep pretending he doesn't. Earl heard it. He understood it. He'd asked questions like that himself, a lifetime ago, before he'd learned enough to stop asking. He picked up his cane, pushed himself to his feet, and walked the 30 feet to bench 9 without saying a word. But what Kyle didn't realise, what nobody at that range could possibly have known, was that Earl Jessup hadn't just worked on Winchester Model 70 rifles. He had written part of the technical manual that the United States Army used to train armourers on controlled feed bolt actions for over 2 decades. Earl stopped at the edge of the bench. He didn't reach for the rifle. He didn't push past anyone. He just stood there, cane in his left hand, and looked at the weapon the way a surgeon looks at a patient, not with curiosity but with recognition. "May I?" he said. 2 words. Quiet. Directed at Dennis, not Kyle, because Earl understood that the rifle belonged to someone, and that someone wasn't the armourer. Dennis looked at him, looked at the cane, looked at the army patch, looked at the hands, those slightly curled, steady, weathered hands, and something in his expression shifted. Not confidence, exactly. More like the absence of a reason to say no. "Go ahead," Dennis said. Kyle stepped back, not happily. His arms were crossed now, his jaw set, and his posture said everything his mouth didn't. That he was watching, that he expected the old man to fumble, and that he was already preparing the polite sentence he'd use to take the rifle back. Earl set his cane against the bench. He reached for the Winchester with both hands, and the moment his fingers touched the stock, something changed in him. His posture straightened, not dramatically, but enough that the people watching noticed. His shoulders settled, his breathing slowed, and his eyes, which had been soft and patient all morning, went sharp. He lifted the rifle, held it at a slight angle, ran his right thumb along the receiver rail, not looking at it, feeling it. Then he brought the rifle to his shoulder, not to aim, but to seat the butt and align his hand with the bolt handle. He cycled the bolt, 1 stroke, back and forward, smooth, deliberate, at exactly the speed he wanted, and then he stopped. His head tilted slightly, the way a musician tilts toward an instrument when a note isn't quite right. He cycled it again, slower this time, and this time he closed his eyes. The range went quiet, not silent. There were still shots being fired 50 yards down the line, and the wind was still pushing through the covered area, but the people at bench 9 went quiet. Because there was something in the way the old man held that rifle that made talking feel wrong. Like interrupting a conversation that had been going on longer than any of them had been alive, Earl opened his eyes. He set the rifle down gently on the rest, turned to Kyle and said, "Your feed ramp's not the problem. Your controlled feed extractor claw is worn down on the engagement surface. You're losing about 0.02 on the hook depth. It's not grabbing the cartridge rim early enough in the feed cycle, so the round is nosediving into the ramp instead of being guided over it. You won't see it with calipers because the wear is concave. It's dished out in the center of the contact face. You'd need a comparator or a shadow graph to measure it properly, but you can feel it if you run your thumbnail across the hook. There's a dip, about the width of a human hair." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. It pressed down on the covered shooting area like a change in barometric pressure. Kyle stared at Earl. His mouth was open, but nothing was coming out. His arms had uncrossed at some point during the old man's explanation, and his hands were now hanging at his sides, palms open, like a man who'd just been told something he didn't know how to hold. Tom Garza pushed off the wall and took a step closer. Dennis Hadley stopped pacing. The two young shooters in tactical vests looked at each other. Nobody spoke. Kyle was the first to move. He turned to the bench, picked up the bolt, and pulled the extractor free from the collar. He held it up to the light, the same way he'd done 3 times already that morning, and this time he ran his thumbnail across the engagement surface of the hook, slowly, from one edge to the other, and he felt it. The dip, barely perceptible, a concave wear pattern in the center of the contact face, invisible to the eye, unmeasurable with standard calipers, but there, absolutely, undeniably there. Kyle's hand dropped to his side. He looked at Earl. "How did you—" He stopped, started again. "How did you know that from cycling the bolt once?" Earl didn't answer right away. He picked up his cane and shifted his weight back to his left side, and for a moment he was just an old man again, stooped, tired, leaning on a piece of hickory. But his eyes were still sharp. "Twice," Earl said. "I cycled it twice." It wasn't a correction. It was precision. And in that single word, twice, Kyle heard something he'd never encountered in any of his textbooks or certification courses. He heard the difference between someone who knows how things work and someone who knows how things feel. Earl continued, his voice low and unhurried. "When the extractor hook is at full spec, you get a clean snap at the end of the forward stroke. The claw grabs the rim and you feel it seat. A little click, right at the end, like a latch catching. Your bolt doesn't do that. It slides past. There's a lag, maybe 1/10 of a second, before the claw engages, and when it does, it's soft, mushy. That tells me the hook isn't reaching far enough to grab the rim at the right point in the cycle, and if it's not reaching, it's either broken or worn. It's not broken. I'd have felt that. Broken gives you a dead spot. This gives you a delay. That's wear. And on a controlled feed extractor that's been in service for 70 years, wear means the hook face is dished. The center goes first because that's where the rim pressure concentrates during extraction." He paused, looked at Dennis. "Your dad fired a lot of rounds through this rifle." Dennis nodded. His eyes were wet. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, he did." "Good rifle," Earl said. "Just needs a new extractor. Brownells carries them. Or if you want an original spec part, I know a machinist in Laramie who does Winchester restoration work. Man named Pete Calderon. Tell him Earl sent you. He'll get it right." Kyle stood at the bench with the extractor still in his hand, turning it over between his fingers like a coin he'd found in a language he couldn't read. The crowd had shifted. The 2 tactical vest shooters had moved closer, and one of them, a guy in his late 20s with a Magpul hat and a plate carrier he clearly didn't need at a public range, was recording on his phone. He'd started filming the moment Earl picked up the rifle, and he hadn't stopped. Tom Garza cleared his throat. "Son," he said to Kyle, "I think you just got a masterclass." Kyle didn't respond. He was staring at the extractor hook, running his thumbnail over that dip again and again, as if repetition might help him understand how he'd missed it. How he'd held this same part 3 times and never felt what the old man felt in one pass. It wasn't embarrassment. Not exactly. It was something deeper. It was the sudden, disorienting realization that the gap between what he knew and what he didn't know was wider than he'd imagined. That his checklist, his careful, methodical textbook checklist, had a hole in it, and the hole wasn't in the list. It was in him. "I checked the extractor," Kyle said, almost to himself. "I measured it." "You measured the length," Earl said, "and the width, and probably the spring tension. All within spec, right?" Kyle nodded. Because those dimensions don't change much. The hook doesn't get shorter, it gets hollowed out. The contact geometry changes, but the overall profile stays the same. Your calipers read the high points on either side of the dish and give you a number that looks right. But the middle, where the work actually happens, is gone. Kyle set the extractor down on the blue towel. He stood there for a long moment, his hands on the bench, his head slightly bowed. Then he looked up at Earl. "Where did you learn that?" Earl's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes moved, a door opening onto a hallway that led back a very long way. "Fort Lee," he said, 1971, and every day after that for the next 38 years. The name meant something, not to everyone, not to the guys in tactical vests, not to Tom Garza, but to Kyle. Fort Lee, Virginia, home of the US Army Ordnance School. The place where the military trains its weapons maintenance specialists, its armourers, its small arms repair technicians. Kyle had considered applying to the Army's armourer program before he'd chosen the civilian route. He knew what Fort Lee meant. He just hadn't expected to meet it at a public range in Routt County, leaning on a cane. "You were Army Ordnance?" Kyle asked. Earl nodded. 38 years, enlisted in 71 as an ordnance specialist, made warrant officer in 83, spent most of my career at unit level, maintaining weapons for line units, infantry, mostly, some special forces support at Bragg, retired in 2009 as a CW4, Chief Warrant Officer 4. Kyle felt the number land in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. CW4 in Ordnance wasn't just a rank, it was a title. It meant decades of unbroken technical mastery. It meant the Army had looked at this man, year after year, and said, "You are the standard. You are what we measure others against." "I spent about 15 years just on bolt-action platforms," Earl continued, as if he were talking about the weather. "Remington 700s, M24 sniper systems, some older Springfield and Winchester actions we kept in the inventory for training. I wrote sections of the technical manual for the M24 when we transitioned from the M21, did depot-level overhauls at Anniston and Red River, rebuilt actions that had been through conditions you don't want to hear about." He paused. "After a while, you don't need gauges for the common failures. You learn what right feels like. And when something's wrong, it's not a measurement, it's a sound, a vibration, a feeling in the bolt handle that your hands remember even when your mind doesn't." Dennis Hadley was standing very still. He was looking at Earl the way people look at a photograph they thought they'd lost, with disbelief and gratitude and something that ached. "My dad was ordnance too," Dennis said quietly. "Korea. He was a small arms repairman with the 2nd Infantry Division." Earl turned to him, and for the first time all morning the old man smiled. It was small, barely a movement, but it changed his entire face. "Then he would have known exactly what I just told you," Earl said. "Probably would have been faster about it too. Those career-era guys didn't have half the tools we had. They learned by feel because they had no choice." Dennis's chin trembled. He pressed his lips together and nodded, and he didn't trust himself to speak. The moment sat there, fragile and enormous, in the space between two men who had never met, but who were connected by a lineage of hands and metal and service that stretched back further than either of them could see. And the guy in the Magpul hat was still recording. He didn't know it yet, but that video would be seen by 400,000 people in less than a week. Kyle picked up the bolt components and began reassembling them with hands that were steadier now. Not because the embarrassment had faded, it hadn't, but because something had replaced it. Something that felt less like shame and more like hunger. He wanted to understand. He slid the extractor back into the collar, seated the collar on the bolt body and held the assembly up. "Would you show me," he asked Earl, "the feel thing? How you know from the bolt cycle? Would you walk me through it?" Earl studied him. Not unkindly, but carefully, the way a man studies a question before deciding whether the person asking it is ready for the answer. He must have decided Kyle was because he set his cane against the bench again and held out his hand. Kyle placed the bolt assembly in Earl's palm. Earl held it loosely, almost carelessly, the way a violinist holds a bow, firm enough to control it, loose enough to feel everything. He inserted the bolt into the receiver and cycled it forward with a cartridge in the magazine. "Here," he said, "put your hand on top of mine." Kyle hesitated. Then he placed his hand over Earl's, his young, smooth hand over the old man's scarred, weathered one, and felt the bolt move. Feel that? Earl said. Right at the end of the forward stroke, there's supposed to be a snap, a definite engagement. Whoa, you should feel the claw grab the rim right. He cycled it again, slowly. Here, at about 3/4 forward travel. On this rifle, it's not grabbing until the bolt is almost fully closed. That's your delay. That's your 0.02. Kyle felt it. Not the measurement. He couldn't feel 0.02 of an inch. But he felt the delay. The softness at the end of the stroke where there should have been crispness. The absence of that snap. I feel it, Kyle said. And his voice had changed. The defensiveness was gone. The edge was gone. What was left was something Earl recognized because he'd heard it in his own voice once, a long time ago. In a cinder-block classroom at Fort Lee when a master armourer named Sergeant First Class William Delacroix had put a deliberately sabotaged M16 bolt carrier group in his hands and said, "Tell me what's wrong with it. Don't look. Feel." Earl had gotten it wrong the first time, and the second. By the third week, he was getting it right. By the third year, he didn't get it wrong anymore. "It takes time," Earl said, pulling his hand back. "You can't shortcut it. You just have to put your hands on 1,000 bolts and pay attention to every single one." Kyle nodded. He was still holding the rifle, and he was looking at it differently now, not as a problem to solve, but as a language to learn. The crowd at Bench 9 began to thin out as people drifted back to their own lanes. Tom Garza shook Earl's hand before he left, a firm, two-handed grip that said more than the words would have. The father from Bench 5 walked over, introduced himself as Mark, and said his own father had been Army Ordnance in Vietnam. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The nod they exchanged was its own vocabulary. Dennis Hadley was the last to leave the bench area. He had carefully placed his Winchester back in its padded case, and he held the case against his chest the way some people hold things that are more than objects. He stood in front of Earl and seemed to search for words that were adequate to the moment. He didn't find them. "Thank you," he said finally. "That rifle. It's the only thing I have left of his." "I know," Earl said, and the way he said it, with no elaboration, no sympathy speech. Just those two words carrying the weight of a man who understood exactly what it meant to hold a piece of metal that connected you to someone who was gone, made Dennis press his lips together and look away for a moment. When he looked back, he said, "I'll call Pete Calderon. I'll tell him Earl sent me." "He'll take care of you," Earl said. Dennis extended his hand. Earl took it, and in the grip, brief, firm, the kind of handshake that means something between men who work with their hands, there was a transfer, not of knowledge, of trust. Dennis walked to his truck. Earl watched him go, and for a moment, standing there at Bench 9 with his cane in one hand and the smell of solvent and gunpowder in the air, Earl felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Useful. Not useful in the way the VA used the word, as a clinical metric. A checkbox on a wellness form, useful in the way that mattered. A man with knowledge that someone needed, in a moment where that knowledge made a difference. Kyle was cleaning up his bench. He'd put his tools back in the roll, wiped down the magnetic tray and folded the blue shop towel with the absent precision of a man whose mind was somewhere else. Earl was about to leave. He'd picked up his rifle case from Bench 12 and was heading for the parking lot. When Kyle called out to him, "Sir?" Earl stopped, turned. "I owe you an apology," Kyle said. He walked over, his hands at his sides, his posture straighter than it had been all morning. "When you first asked about the feed ramp, I blew you off. I shouldn't have done that. I looked at you and I made an assumption. And the assumption was wrong." Earl looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You didn't make an assumption about me. You made an assumption about the problem. You assumed your checklist was complete. It wasn't. That's not a character flaw. That's a training gap. And training gaps close." Kyle exhaled. Something loosened in his chest. "Would you—" he started, then stopped. "Would you be willing to come back sometime? I'd like to learn. The feel thing, the listening. I know I can't pick it up in a day, but—" "Every other Saturday," Earl said. "I'm here by 9. Kyle nodded. "I'll be here." Earl turned toward the parking lot. He was 3 steps away when Kyle said one more thing. "Sir, what's your name?" "Jessup," Earl said without turning around. "Earl Jessup." Kyle pulled out his phone. He didn't know why. Instinct, maybe. Or the feeling that he needed to remember this moment with more than just his memory. He typed the name into a search bar, and 20 seconds later, standing in the morning sun at Bench 9 of the Root County Public Shooting Range, Kyle Beckett read something that made him sit down on the bench and put his phone in his lap and stare at the mountains for a very long time. Because the search results didn't just show an Army armourer, they showed a name that appeared in 3 different Department of the Army technical manuals, a name listed as a contributing author on the M24 Sniper Weapon System Maintenance Manual, the same manual Kyle had studied in school, a name attached to a Meritorious Service Medal, 2 Army Commendation Medals, and a career that spanned every major US. A military operation from the late Cold War through the global war on terror. The old man with the cane had literally written the book that Kyle learned from, and Kyle had told him he appreciated his input. The video went up that evening. The guy in the Magpul hat, his name was Derek and he ran a small firearms channel on YouTube, posted it with the title, Old Timer School's Armourer on Bolt Action Diagnosis. The thumbnail was a still frame of Earl holding the Winchester, eyes closed, head tilted. By Monday morning it had 40,000 views. By Friday it had crossed 400,000, and the comments section had turned into something none of them expected. Veterans were posting, active duty armourers were posting, gunsmiths with 30 years of experience were posting. And they were all saying the same thing. I knew a man like that. I served with a man like that. I was trained by a man like that. The video made its way to a Facebook group for retired Army Ordnance personnel, and within that group someone identified Earl, not by face, by technique. A retired CW5 named Linda Fraser, who had served at Anniston Army Depot, commented, "That right-hand thumb placement on the receiver rail, that's a Fort Lee tell. I'd bet money that man trained under Delacroix." She was right. Someone forwarded the video to the Ordnance Corps Association. Someone else sent it to the Public Affairs Office at Fort Lee. And 3 weeks after Earl Jessup stood at Bench 9 and cycled a bolt twice, he received a phone call from a colonel who introduced herself as the commandant of the Ordnance School and asked if he would be willing to come back to Fort Lee, not as a student, but as a guest instructor. Earl said no. He said it politely, the way he did everything, but he said it. He told the colonel he appreciated the offer, but he was 78 years old with 2 bad knees and he didn't travel well. What he didn't say was that he didn't need Fort Lee to validate what he already knew, and he didn't need a title to do what he'd been doing all his life. He told her he was happy at his range in Colorado. He told her he had a student. And when the colonel asked what he was teaching, Earl said, "How to listen." Kyle Beckett showed up at the range the following Saturday at 8:30, 30 minutes before Earl's usual arrival. He brought a folding chair, a thermos of black coffee, and a pre-1964 Mauser 98 action he'd bought at a gun show for $60 specifically to practice on. When Earl pulled into the gravel lot in his Silverado, Kyle was already at Bench 9, the Mauser disassembled on a blue towel, his hands folded in his lap, waiting. Earl looked at the bench, looked at the coffee, looked at the Mauser, looked at Kyle. "You're early," he said. "Figured I had some catching up to do," Kyle said. Earl set down his cane and picked up the Mauser bolt. He cycled it once into the action, eyes closed, head tilted. Then he handed it to Kyle. "Tell me what's wrong with it," Earl said. Kyle took the bolt. He inserted it, cycled it forward and closed his eyes the way he'd seen Earl do. He held his breath, and he felt something. Not precisely. Not with Earl's clarity. But something at the edge of perception. A whisper of resistance where there should have been none. A texture in the movement that didn't belong. "I think," Kyle started. "Don't think," Earl said. "Feel. Do it again." Kyle cycled the bolt again, and on the 4th pass he said, "There's a rough spot about halfway through the forward stroke. Left lug track, I think." Earl's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Left lug track. Burr on the cam surface. Probably from someone reassembling with the bolt rotated wrong. You'd take about 1,000th off with a hard Arkansas stone and it'd be perfect. Kyle opened his eyes. "Was I right?" "Close enough for the first lesson," Earl said. He picked up his cane and walked to Bench 12 to uncase his Remington. Behind him, Kyle stood at Bench 9 with a Mauser bolt in his hands and a look on his face that was somewhere between wonder and determination. It was the same look Earl had worn in a cinder block classroom at Fort Lee in 1971, when a master armourer named William Delacroix had put a sabotaged bolt carrier in his hands and changed the trajectory of his entire life. They met every other Saturday after that. Rain, wind, or cold, it didn't matter. Kyle brought different actions each time, old Springfields, commercial Mausers, sporterized military rifles picked up at estate sales and pawn shops. Earl would hand him a bolt and say, "Tell me," and Kyle would close his eyes, cycle the action, and try to hear what the metal was saying. He got it wrong more than he got it right at first. Earl never told him he was wrong, and he'd just say, "Again," and Kyle would cycle the bolt again. After 6 weeks, Kyle could distinguish between extractor wear and ejector spring fatigue by feel alone. After 3 months, he could identify a headspace variance of less than 0.002 without gauges. After 6 months, he stopped using his checklist first. He used his hands first, and then the checklist. The regulars at the range noticed, the guys in tactical vests, who had initially smirked at the old man with the cane teaching the young armourer with his eyes closed, stopped smirking. They started asking questions. They started bringing their own rifles to bench 9, not because they were broken, but because they wanted to know. What does a good bolt cycle feel like? How do I know when my extractor is going? What should I be listening for? And Earl answered every question the same way. He put a rifle in their hands and said, "Tell me." The range manager, a woman named Sandra Orozco, watched this happen over the course of months. She watched the old man in the canvas jacket turn bench 9 into an informal classroom. She watched Kyle Beckett go from a competent technician to something rarer, an armourer who understood weapons not as assemblies of parts, but as systems that spoke if you knew how to listen. And one afternoon in October, after Earl had spent 3 hours walking 5 different shooters through the differences between Mauser type and push-feed extraction by feel, Sandra walked over and asked if he'd be interested in running a monthly clinic, a formal thing, advertised, open to the public. Earl looked at his cane, looked at the bench, looked at Kyle, who was showing a teenager how to hold a bolt handle with the right amount of grip. "I'd need a chair," Earl said. "We'll get you a chair," Sandra said. The first clinic had 9 people. The second had 22. The third had 41, and Sandra had to set up folding chairs in the parking area behind the covered line. Earl didn't teach the way schools teach. He didn't use slides or manuals or diagrams. He taught the way craftsmen have always taught, by putting the work in someone's hands and asking them to feel the difference between right and wrong. He'd bring a box of bolts, some perfect, some deliberately damaged, and he'd pass them around the circle. "This one's good," he'd say, handing someone a bolt. "Cycle it, remember how that feels." Then he'd hand them another. "Now this one. Tell me what's different." And people would frown and concentrate and cycle the bolt again and again, and eventually, sometimes quickly, sometimes after 20 minutes, they'd say, "It's gritty, there's something catching." And Earl would nod. "Now you're listening." It was never fast, it was never flashy. It was an old man with a cane and a box of bolts, and a patience that seemed infinite, sitting in a folding chair at a public range in a small Colorado town, passing along something that no textbook could contain. The knowledge of hands, the memory of metal, the understanding that precision isn't a number on a gauge. It's a feeling in your fingers that took 40 years to grow. Kyle assisted at every clinic. He became Earl's translator in a way, bridging the gap between Earl's instinctive, yet feel-based approach and the technical vocabulary that younger armourers understood. When Earl said the bolt's singing flat, Kyle would explain that meant the lug engagement was uneven. When Earl said there's a ghost in the striker channel, Kyle would translate that to firing pin drag. They made an odd pair, the old man who knew everything by feel and the young man who was learning to trust his hands over his instruments. But it worked. The regulars started calling bench 9 Jessup's classroom. Someone made a hand-painted wooden sign and hung it on the partition. Sandra let it stay. One Saturday in late November, after the last clinic attendee had packed up and left, Kyle and Earl sat alone at bench 9. The range was empty. The wind had died. The sun was low over the western mountains, turning the sky the colour of brass casings. Earl was sitting in his folding chair, his cane across his knees, looking out at the 300-yard berm. Kyle was cleaning a practice bolt on a shop towel. "Can I ask you something?" Kyle said. "You just did," Earl said. Kyle smiled. "When you walked up to the bench that first day when I blew you off, were you angry?" Earl thought about it. Actually thought about it. The way he thought about everything. Slowly. Thoroughly. Like running a gauge across a surface. "No," he said. "I was sad." "Sad?" "Not for me, for the rifle. That Winchester was talking and nobody was listening. That's the saddest thing I know. Something trying to tell you what's wrong and nobody hearing it." Kyle was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I hear them now." Earl turned his head and looked at him. Looked at his hands. Still young, but steadier now. Calloused in new places. Holding the bolt with the right amount of grip, the right amount of patience. "Yeah," Earl said. "You do." They sat there in the quiet as the sun went down, two armourers at a bench. The smell of solvent and coffee in the air. The mountains turning purple in the distance. No rank between them. No age. Just the shared understanding that some things can only be passed from hand to hand, and that the passing matters more than the knowing. If this story moved you, if you believe that skill earned over a lifetime deserves respect, that the quietest person in the room might know the most, and that real knowledge lives in the hands as much as the mind, then subscribe to this channel. We find these stories because they matter, because in a world that worships speed, there are still people who worship precision. And Earl Jessup, 78 years old, leaning on a hickory cane at a public range in Colorado, is proof that some things only get sharper with age.